Before we begin this story, we must speak the truth. Religious intolerance is not just a disagreement. It is a crime. In the United States, the right to practice your faith is protected by the Constitution, and any act of hate, harassment, or violence based on religion is a federal offense. We denounce every form of prejudice against African matrix religions. If you believe in freedom, respect, and human dignity, subscribe to this channel, share this video, and let's make sure this message reaches those who try to silence us. We will not be silent. I remember the smell of white roses and lavender that used to fill my house every Friday morning. It was a scent that didn't just linger in the air. It lived in the walls, in the curtains, and in the very pores of my skin. My name is Eleanor, and for 50 years, my home was my sanctuary. I grew up watching my grandmother light candles and spread white cloths over the table. Her voice a low hum of ancient prayers that felt like a warm blanket on a cold night. Our faith, rooted in the deep, rhythmic heartbeat of our African ancestors, was never about loud proclamations. It was about the earth, the water, the leaves, and the silent strength of the orishas who guided us through the storms of life. When I married Marcus and we moved into this neighborhood in the suburbs of Maryland, I felt like I had finally reached the shore after a long journey at sea. It was a quiet street, lined with oak trees that turned golden in the fall. Our neighbors were people who waved from their porches, people who traded gardening tips and recipes for apple pie. For 20 years, I felt like I belonged. I was the woman who baked bread for the local charity drives. I was the one who helped Mrs. Gable find her lost cat in the middle of a thunderstorm. I thought they saw me. I truly believe they saw my heart before they saw the white clothes I wore on special days, or the clay pots nestled among my garden ferns. Marcus didn't share my faith in the same way, but he respected it with a quiet devotion that was its own kind of prayer. He loved the way I hummed while I prepared the offerings of fruit and honey. He would sit on the porch, watching me tend to my herbs rosemary for protection, rue for cleansing, and he would say that the garden always looked greener when I was talking to the spirits of the plants. We built a life of peace. Our daughter, Maya, grew up between two worlds, learning the science of her school books and the wisdom of the shells. I would cast on the wooden table when the moon was full. In those early years, the neighborhood felt like a protective cocoon. There was an unspoken agreement of kindness. When the sun began to set, the street lights would flicker on, casting a soft, amber glow over our driveway, and I felt safe. I felt that my altars, tucked away in a quiet corner of our sunroom, were radiating a light that blessed everyone who walked past our gate. I didn't hide who I was, but I didn't shout it either. My faith was like my breath, essential, constant, and quiet. I remember one specific afternoon, about 10 years ago. The air was thick with the heat of July, and the cicadas were singing their rhythmic, buzzing song in the trees. I was in the backyard, wearing my traditional white lace wrap, pouring water onto the roots of a young baobab tree. I had managed to cultivate against all odds in this soil. My neighbor from 3 houses down, a man named Mr. Henderson, leaned over the fence. He asked me what I was doing, his eyes curious, but not unkind. I told him I was nourishing the spirit of the tree, thanking it for the shade it would one day provide. He laughed, a genuine, hearty sound, and said, "Well, Eleanor, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Your yard is the only one that hasn't turned brown this summer." That was the world I thought I lived in. A world where a woman could honor her ancestors and her gods without being looked at as a stranger or a threat. I felt that the community was a tapestry, and my thread, though a different color and texture, was woven tightly into the fabric. We went to the neighborhood potlucks. We contributed to the school funds. We were the good neighbors. I took pride in that title. I took pride in the fact that my home was a place of healing. When a neighbor was sick, I brought them tea made from the herbs in my garden and whispered a prayer for their recovery. They always took the tea. They always thanked me. But looking back now, through the lens of the pain that followed, I wonder if the peace was real, or if it was just a fragile glass dome, waiting for the first stone to be thrown. I wonder if they truly accepted me, or if they merely tolerated me as long as my otherness stayed behind my closed doors, or deep in the shadows of my garden. I spent decades building a life on the foundation of love and spiritual connection, never imagining that the very people I call friends would one day look at the sacred symbols of my life and see something to be feared, something to be hated. The beginning was perfect because I was blind to the shadows growing at the edges of the light. I believed that goodness was a shield. I believed that if I gave love to the earth and to my community, the earth and the community would always give it back. I walked through my rooms, touching the wood of the furniture Marcus had built, looking at the photos of Maya's graduation, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude. I was a black woman, a practitioner of a faith that had survived the Middle Passage, slavery, and centuries of erasure. And here I was, thriving in a beautiful house on a beautiful street. I felt invincible in my peace. I felt that my wishes had placed a mantle of protection over my roof. How naive I was to think that the darkness of human prejudice couldn't penetrate the walls of a home built on faith. Comprendido. Vamos a profundar es momento crítico de violencia y persecución sistemática. A través do abuso de poder, focando no desgaste emocional que essa burocracia corrupta causa. Como estamos focando en una expanso de hojada deses eventos. Est contordo severa, para intensificar o bloco for ocho que o bloco 5 o confronto. De tal hondo a face mais cruel da intolerancia. English version primary continuation blocks 4 and 5. The assault and the corruption. I remember the day the air finally broke. I was coming back from the market, the sun setting in a bruised purple hue over the neighborhood. I stepped out of the Uber, my arms laden with bags of white corn and honey for the Friday offerings. As I closed the car door, the silence of the street was shattered by a voice that sounded like grinding stones. It was him, the neighbor who had once praised my garden, now transformed by a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't just speak, he spat the words. Voodoo witch, he snarled, his face contorted into something unrecognizable. We don't want your filth and your demons on this street. Go back to where you came from before we burn it all down. The insults weren't just words. They were physical blows. He called my faith a sickness, a stain on the decency of the neighborhood. I stood frozen, the bags trembling in my hands, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But he wasn't finished with words. He lunged toward me, his hand raised in a fist, his eyes bloodshot with a fanaticism that defied logic. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact, but it never came. The Uber driver, a young man who had been silent the whole trip, had leaped out of the car. He stood between us, a human shield of unexpected courage. Back off, he shouted, his voice steady and firm. I'm recording everything. You touch her, and you're going to jail today. The aggressor recoiled, but the venom in his gaze didn't fade. He pointed a shaking finger at me, and then at the driver. You don't know what she is, he hissed, but you'll find out. Everyone in this town will find out. That was only the beginning of a different kind of war. This man wasn't just a hateful neighbor. He was a man with tentacles in the local government. A man who used his influence like a weapon of attrition. Soon, the letters started arriving. Official envelopes with the city seal, demanding fines for sanitary violations, noise complaints that never happened, and illegal structures in my garden that were nothing more than small stone altars. Every time I received one, a piece of my spirit withered. I had to spend hours, days, filling out forms, collecting evidence, and appearing before boards to prove that I wasn't breaking any laws. And every single time, the fines were overturned because they had no basis in reality. They were ghost charges, fabrications of a corrupt mind using the system to harass a woman for the crime of existing. While faithful, the physical toll was immense. My hands would shake as I typed the appeals. I lost weight, the stress keeping me awake as I replayed the image of his fist in the air. It wasn't just the money. It was the exhaustion of having to constantly justify my right to breathe, to pray, and to live in the home I had paid for with years of honest work. He wanted to drain me. He wanted to make the cost of my faith so high that I would simply disappear. He was using the law to commit a crime, turning the machinery of the state into a tool for religious persecution. The sound of the mail slot in my front door, which used to be a mundane part of my morning, became a trigger for a panic that I could feel in the very marrow of my bones. Every time the metal flapped shut, the metallic clack echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. I would stand there, paralyzed for a few seconds, staring at the floor, praying to the Orishas that it was just a catalog or a simple utility bill. But more often than not, there it was, another thick, white envelope from the municipal office. Another summons, another invented infraction. They were attacking my sanctuary through paperwork. They weren't just fining me. They were trying to rewrite the reality of my life. One notice claimed I was handling hazardous biological materials because I had bowls of water and flowers on my porch. Another claimed disturbing the peace on a night when Marcus and I were out of town, visiting our daughter. The absurdity of it didn't make it any less painful. In fact, the lack of logic made it more terrifying. It meant there were no rules. It meant that as long as that neighbor had his friends in the zoning department, I was a target. I spent my evenings hunched over the kitchen table, the yellow light of the lamp casting long, tired shadows across the wood. Instead of reading my sacred texts or preparing my herbs, I was surrounding myself with legal jargon, printer ink, and photocopies of my property deed. My eyes would burn from reading the same bureaucratic lies over and over. Religious intolerance is a crime, I would whisper to myself, my voice cracking in the empty room. This is illegal. This is a violation. But the ink on the page didn't care about my rights. It only cared about the pressure it was exerting on my heart. The emotional exhaustion was a heavy, wet blanket that I couldn't shake off. I started looking at my own garden, my place of power and peace, and seeing only potential violations. I caught myself looking at the sacred baobab tree and wondering if they would try to force me to cut it down next. I began to feel like a prisoner in the house I had worked so hard to buy. Every time I stepped outside to get the mail or water my plants, I felt his eyes on me. I knew he was behind his curtains, watching, waiting for me to falter, waiting for the weight of the bureaucracy to finally break my back. It was a slow, calculated theft of my joy. I stopped singing my prayers. I started whispering them, terrified that a microphone or a corrupt inspector might be listening, ready to twist my devotion into a noise violation. The corruption was so deep that when I went to the city office to file my appeals, the clerks wouldn't even look me in the eye. They knew the fines were baseless. They saw the evidence I brought, the photos, the timestamps, the logs of my quiet life, and they would sigh, stamp the paper, and tell me it was under review. They were cogs in a machine designed to wear me down, and the physical toll manifested in a constant, dull ache in my chest that no herbal tea could soothe. The silence that followed the peak of the harassment was the heaviest I had ever known. For weeks, I lived like a ghost in my own hallways. Marcus and I spoke in hushed tones, as if the very walls had ears. I had stopped gardening. My beautiful baobab tree looked lonely, its leaves slightly drooping, as if it felt the absence of my touch and my songs. The street felt cold, even under the mid-August sun. I felt like a pariah, convinced that the neighbor's poison had finally seeped into the minds of everyone on our block. I expected glares. I expected more turned backs. But the human spirit has a way of surprising you when you are at your lowest point. It started with small, quiet acts of defiance against the hate. One Tuesday morning, I found a bouquet of white carnations tucked into the handle of my front door. There was no note, just the flowers, fresh and dew-kissed. A few days later, Mrs. Gable, the neighbor whose cat I had saved years ago, walked across her lawn as I was tentatively checking the mailbox. She didn't just wave this time. She walked all the way to my porch, her eyes fierce and wet with tears. She took my shaking hands in hers and whispered, "We know, Eleanor. We see what he is doing, and we are not going to let him do it anymore." That was the spark. It turned out that the paper war hadn't been as secret as the aggressor thought. Word had spread about the Uber driver who stood his ground, and about the endless stream of city inspectors who were suddenly obsessed with my perfectly kept yard. The neighborhood wasn't a collection of strangers after all. It was a community that had been watching the injustice in a paralyzed state of shock, waiting for someone to lead the way back to decency. The turning point came when a town hall meeting was scheduled to discuss local zoning improvements. A thinly veiled attempt by my neighbor's corrupt associates to pass even stricter regulations that would target my spiritual practices. I didn't want to go. I was tired. My body ached with a fatigue that felt permanent. But Marcus looked at me, his eyes reflecting the strength of the ancestors. I thought I had failed. "If you don't go, Eleanor, he wins. Not because he is right, but because he made you afraid." When we walked into that community center, my heart was a drum of anxiety. I expected to be the only one there to defend my life. But as I opened the double doors, I gasped. The first 3 rows were filled with my neighbors. They weren't wearing the suits of lawyers or the uniforms of officials. They were wearing their everyday clothes, the clothes they wore to mow their lawns, to walk their dogs, to live their lives, and many of them, in a silent, powerful gesture of solidarity, were wearing a piece of white clothing, a white scarf, a white shirt, a white ribbon pinned to a lapel. The aggressor was there, sitting near the front, looking smug next to a local councilman I recognized from the signatures on my fines. When the floor was opened for public comment, the neighbor stood up, his voice dripping with false concern about property values and unusual rituals. He spoke as if I weren't in the room, but when he finished, he didn't receive the nods of agreement he expected. Instead, there was a heavy, suffocating silence. Then, one by one, the neighborhood stood up. Dotmer Henderson, the man who liked my garden, spoke first. I've lived next to Eleanor for 20 years, he said, his voice echoing in the hall. The only thing she has ever brought to this street is kindness and peace. If her faith makes her that kind, then maybe we all need a little more of it. These fines are a disgrace. They are a crime against a good neighbor, and they are a crime against the values of this town. One by one, they shared stories of the bread I had baked, the tea I had brewed, and the way I had always been the first to offer a hand in a crisis. They didn't just defend me. They denounced the corruption. They called out the councilman by name. They demanded to know why public resources were being used to settle a personal vendetta, fueled by religious hatred. The smug look on the aggressor's face didn't just fade, it curdled into a mask of fear. He realized, in that moment, that hate is only powerful when it operates in the dark. Once the light of a community is turned on, hate has nowhere to hide. That night, as we walked back to our car, the air felt different. It was lighter. The weight that had been crushing my chest for months didn't disappear completely, but it shifted. I realized that while the law had been used as a weapon against me, the truth was my shield. The aftermath of the trauma wasn't just about the scars. It was about the discovery that I wasn't alone. My faith hadn't just protected me, it had built a bridge to the hearts of people I thought were worlds apart from me. The final blow to the walls of hate didn't come from a miracle, but from the cold, hard light of the truth. After the town hall meeting, I realized I couldn't just keep defending myself. I had to go on the offensive. With the help of the community's support, I hired a legal team that specialized in civil rights and government corruption. We didn't just want the fines dropped. We wanted to know exactly who was pulling the strings. What my lawyers found in the public records was the final piece of the puzzle, and it was a revelation that turned the neighborhood's stomach. My pious neighbor, the man who spent his mornings judging my faith and calling me a danger to society, was a convicted felon. My lead attorney, Sarah, sat me down in her office and laid out the documents. 10 years ago, in another state, he had served 4 years in federal prison for aggravated assault and hate crimes. He had moved here under a cloud of secrecy, trying to reinvent himself as a pillar of morality while hiding a history of violence and incarceration. The very man who called my religious symbols dangerous had been behind bars for actually hurting human beings. When this information was leaked legally and strategically, the house of cards collapsed. The corrupt councilman, terrified of being linked to a violent ex-con, immediately retracted every single fine. An internal investigation was launched into the zoning department, and heads began to roll. The bureaucracy that had been used to choke my spirit was now being dismantled by the same hands that built it. The aggressor, unable to face the people who now knew exactly what he was, put a for sale sign in his yard within a week. He disappeared into the night, just as quietly as his hate had once grown. Today, I am back in my garden. The white roses are in full bloom, and the baobab tree stands tall, its branches reaching for a sky that no longer feels heavy with threats. I wear my white lace without fear. The smell of lavender and honey has returned to the hallways of my home, but it feels different now. It smells like victory. It smells like the resilience of a faith that cannot be broken by petty men or corrupt systems. I learned that religious intolerance is a coward's game. It relies on the silence of the good and the shadows of the law. But when we stand up, when we document every insult and fight every unjust fine, the light becomes blinding. I look at my neighbors now, Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Gable, and the young Uber driver who still stops by for tea, and I see a new kind of family. We are bound not by blood or by the same prayers, but by the shared belief that everyone has the right to reach for the divine in their own way. My name is Eleanor. I am a daughter of the Oryxis. I am a survivor of a crime that tried to wear the mask of order. And as I light my candles tonight, I don't just pray for protection. I pray for the courage of those who are still fighting in the dark. To anyone being persecuted for their faith, do not hide. Do not let the paperwork dim your light. The truth is a slow-moving river, but it eventually washes away every lie. I am still here. My faith is still here, and we are stronger than we have ever been. The for sale sign in his yard wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning of his final reckoning. My legal team filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit for harassment, emotional distress, and violation of civil rights, while the district attorney, pressured by the evidence we gathered, opened a criminal case for stalking and hate crimes. The day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. He sat at the defense table, no longer the arrogant bully of the neighborhood, but a small, desperate man whose past had finally caught up with him. The judge was a woman who spoke with the authority of a mountain. She didn't just look at the fines, she looked at the intent behind them. When the Uber driver took the stand and played the recording of the neighbor's hateful slurs and the attempted physical assault, a cold shiver ran through the room. My lawyers then presented the evidence of his prior incarceration, proving a pattern of violent prejudice. The defense tried to claim freedom of speech, but the judge cut through the lies like a blade. Freedom of speech is not a license to terrorize, she declared. Using government machinery to persecute a citizen for her faith is not just a neighborly dispute, it is a frontal assault on the Constitution. The verdict was a roar of justice for the criminal charges of stalking and hate-motivated harassment. He was sentenced to an additional 5 years in state prison, with no possibility of early parole given his prior record. But the victory didn't stop there. In the civil suit, the jury awarded me a staggering $250,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. They wanted to send a message that the cost of hate in this community is higher than anyone can afford to pay. I remember the moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The sound was different from the clack of the mail slot that used to terrify me. This sound was final. This sound was the law doing exactly what it was meant to do, protecting the innocent from the predator. As he was led away, he didn't look at me. He couldn't. The light of the truth was too bright for him to face. The money from the settlement didn't change who I am, but it changed what I could do. I used a portion of it to create a local foundation that provides legal aid to victims of religious intolerance. I turned my pain into a shield for others. The rest went into my garden, turning it into a lush, green monument to resilience. Justice didn't just return my peace, it validated my existence. It proved that in the face of deep, painful, and systematic hate, a woman of faith armed with the truth and the support of her community can bring a giant to his knees. Violence is not always a physical blow. Sometimes it is the slow poison of a legal system bent to the will of a bigot. It is the psychological warfare of making a person feel like a stranger in their own home. We must name this for what it is: a crime against humanity. When someone attacks your faith, they are attacking the very core of your identity, the bridge between you and your ancestors, the breath that keeps you standing. Religious intolerance, whether it comes in the form of a slur shouted on a sidewalk or a corrupt fine delivered by a city official, is a cancer that eats away at the fabric of our society. We cannot afford to be tolerant of intolerance. The image of that man in handcuffs was not just a personal victory for me. It was a warning to every person who thinks their influence or their hate places them above the law. In this country, Freedom of religion is not a suggestion, it is a cornerstone. To use corruption to harass a practitioner of an African matrix religion is not just a neighborly dispute. It is a federal civil rights violation. We must report these acts. We must document them. We must refuse to be intimidated by the paperwork or the power of those who hide behind badges and titles. Every time we remain silent, the aggressor grows stronger. Every time we speak up, their shadow shrinks. My house is quiet again, but it is a powerful silence. It is the silence of a battlefield after the victory has been won. I want this story to serve as a shield for anyone who feels the walls closing in. You are not alone. Your faith is your right. Your peace is worth fighting for. We are denouncing every act of hate, every silent nod of a corrupt clerk, and every fist raised in the name of prejudice. We are here. We are staying, and we will continue to plant our gardens and sing our prayers to the sky. If this story moved you, if you believe that no one should ever be persecuted for their faith, then you are part of our community. Do not let this message stop with you. Subscribe to the channel right now to support stories of truth and resilience. Like this video to show the world that we stand with Elena and against religious hate. And most importantly, share this video. Share it to denounce intolerance. Share it to remind everyone that religious persecution is a crime and that, together, we are an unbreakable wall of justice. Thank you for standing with us.